The origin of this report lies in Mr. Martins, who was the real founder of the Oxford Martin School, who unfortunately passed away last June, that there is a growingly and worrying gap between what we know about challenges for this planet in the decades to come and the capacity of actors, whether in the world of politics, in the world of business, in the world of civil society, to address them properly. His initial mandate, when I had to compose the commission together with Jan Golding, who is the boss of the Oxford Martin School, was how can we put on the table suggestions, proposals that will bridge better than now this dichotomy between, again, what we know of the future of this planet and our capacity to address the many challenges this implies. Hence the title of the report. It's a report about future generations, but the focus is on, quote unquote, now for the long term. The basic idea being that it is now that we need to start addressing more seriously a number of long-term issues confronting this planet. The composition of the Commission was in the spirit of what the Oxford Martin School is, i.e. luminaries from all over the world, different continents, different experiences, different cultures, and the time it took to compose the Commission with this diversity of views was, I think, very usefully spent. And I won't detail the composition of the Commission, which you will find in the report, either its written version or the website version, which, by the way, has been downloaded, if I understand well, 75,000 times, which is much more than what I would have expected at the origin. So I won't expand on the composition of the committee. Let me just say that since the report was issued, two of the members of the Commission were promoted. One is Michel Bachelet, who became the president of Chile in the meantime. Another one is Minister Liu He, who then was planning minister in China, and who got one big promotion. I'm not sure it's because of the report, but that's what happened. Now, the report is divided in basically three parts. The first one is about the identification of what the commissioners saw as the main megatrends and challenges of humanity. The time horizon being sort of between 10 and 30 years from now. So we outline these various what we call megatrends, whether it's population, whether it's society, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's inequalities, whether it's the pressure on natural resources, the whole issue which is related to environment. On this, nothing really unexpected. If you read the report, those of you who've already read UN, CIA, defense, long-term studies, whether US, EU, China, will not find anything dramatically different. We just try and spot what we see as the main drivers of the world of tomorrow. And we know that in these various areas, we have specific challenges. We know that on the population/society side, the good news is that the world middle class, who's today about 2 billion people, will probably be 5 billion people in 2030. The plus 3 coming from 2 billion of them from Asia, and roughly 1 billion for Latin America and Africa. So this 3 billion people reaching middle class is obviously good news for the development of the economy and the society. But there is a flip side to that, which is that if we look at what happened in recent decades, as well as what we can expect in development of societies for the next decade, this huge push that lifts billions of people out of poverty has also been concomitant with a significant rise in inequalities. So, less poverty in proportions which humanity never lived before, but also more inequality. We also know that the sort of economic engine which is plus 3 billion people reaching the middle class, the pressure it exerts on natural resources is in many ways unsustainable. Whether it's water, whether it's air, whether it's climate, that's also an issue which clearly needs to be addressed. We also know that these developments, for instance, in the sector of health, go with new, huge challenges in, for instance, non-communicable diseases. An example of obesity being the one that comes immediately to mind. So, I'm just giving you a sort of sample, a sort of indication of the sort of positive side and the sort of possible negative sides of this important development. The second part of the report is much more original. And this is, by the way, where the Commission immensely benefited from the input of the pluridisciplinary teams of the Oxford Martin School. Whether it's cosmology, whether it's nanotechnology, whether it's medicines, whether it's economics, whether it's political science, whether it's anthropology, the teams of the Oxford Martin School helped us in analyzing, which was the bulk of where the Commission spent most of its time, in a clinical manner, examples of global challenges for the last 30 years which have worked, to be compared with examples of global challenges we've lived through for the last 30 years which did not work. So there were a bunch of successes, there were a bunch of failures, and where the Oxford Martin School teams helped us a lot is in answering this question: why did what worked work, and why did what didn't work not work? And this has been done in a sort of quasi-scientific manner. For instance, why did HIV/AIDS work reasonably? Why did Y2K, which was this big challenge of moving all IT systems to the year 2000, why did it work extremely well? Why did the issue of repairing the ozone layer hole, why did it work? On the other side, why did financial regulation not work at all on a global scale before the 08 crisis, assuming it's worked a bit better since. That's another discussion. Why did overfishing in oceans not work at all? We all know there is a huge issue with the amount of fish resources that are pulled out of the oceans every day. Why do the negotiations on climate change obviously not work, or certainly not work at the rhythm which would be necessary to address global warming? Why did fighting against tobacco work so-so? So that was the bulk of the work, and on the basis of this analytical approach, sort of experimental approach, the Commission drew a number of conclusions, establishing basically the shaping factors of success and the shaping factors of failure. Now, it's a very complex issue. Again, I won't enter into all the details of these findings. Those of you who are interested in these details can find them in the reports, but some general lessons appeared. For instance, the huge importance of coalitions. In many of these cases, there were issues of leadership, there were issues of institutional quality, there were issues of public mobilization, but the model, if I had to sum up this, again, a whole bunch of reports, and I don't describe it in detail, if I had to sum up what made a difference, one of the main factors that made a difference was that states, public entities, who theoretically today have the monopoly of international relations, civil society, and big business, where it worked was in most cases when coalitions that bound together these three streams succeeded in creating the necessary political energy. It was the case, for instance, for HIV/AIDS. Not that states, international organizations on the public side, civil society, or the pharmaceutical industry a priori agreed on how to fight this hugely growing contamination at some stage. The pharmaceutical industry had an extremely difficult debate within its own unit on differential prices, for instance. Civil society mobilized a lot, notably the victims with HIV/AIDS, who themselves engaged in raising public awareness. And the political system, whether international institutions or states, mobilized quite a lot of political energy in various shapes. We all know that the World Health Organization had to adjust to the situation, and that at the time UNAIDS was created. We all know that, let's say, reasonably conservative administration like the Bush administration surprisingly stepped in quite vigorously in supporting international efforts to fight HIV/AIDS. And we all know that now one of the main operators against this disease, this communicable disease, is the Global Fund, who is a perfect example of a coalition. Who sits on the board of the Global Fund? Public entities, private entities, and civil society representatives. So that's just one example. There are many others, and again, I won't expand into them. This led us, and that's my third and final, pre-final point, to a third part, where the Commission took the initiative of suggesting proposals, tabling possible initiatives that would be better at bridging this short-term, long-term knowledge action gap which we had identified from the very beginning. And this led to 15 proposals, the purpose of which is not to cover extensively the whole of the challenges which we have identified. Again, we used a fairly experimental, pragmatic method. What they have in common is that they've been structured in a way that, if you look at them and if you read the second part of the report, your normal rational conclusion is they might work rather than not work. They've been constructed, they've been thought, they've been put together, building on the lessons of the past, trying to meet as many of the shaping factors of success and overcoming as many of the shaping factors of failure. Again, I won't expand in the whole of the 15 proposals. You can read them, think about them. Let me just mention 2 or 3 of them. For instance, on climate change, what we suggest is not drop the UNFCCC negotiations or forum, but try and build a coalition, which we call C20, 30, 40, between 20 countries, who are the ones that are responsible for 95% of the carbon emissions on this planet, 30 multinationals whose fundamental long-term interest is to have a stable regulatory framework, because this is very important for their business, whether they are in oil drilling or in food processing, or in mining, or in transport, and 40 cities, megapoles, who have already started addressing at their level this issue of carbon emissions. Now, the G20 or something like the G20 exists already. There is already a C30 coalition, by the way, the headquarters of which are in Geneva, which is the World Council on Sustainable Development, which is a business-supported climate change lobby. And there is a C40, which is a club of 40 megapoles, mayors of this planet, who decided some time ago that whatever happens at the level of states or international organization, they believe they have a huge responsibility in moving the thing forward and exchanging best practices and creating a dynamic at their level. So the key there is, can we, and I'll come back to that in a minute, can we put around the same table the 20 states, the 30 multinationals, the 40 megapoles, and direct them towards an agreement on carbon emissions. The idea being that if there is an agreement on carbon emissions around this table, which is not 20,000 people, but 100 people, then the rest will follow. So that's one of the suggestions we made. In another area, which is the area of statistics, we obviously, in our findings, assessed that where it worked and didn't work, one of the differences was the availability of good quality numbers. Now, we know that some numbers are very good quality. We know that others are sort of junk numbers, and that is the problem. For instance, if I look at the example I mentioned about overfishing, we know that there's a whole big uncertainty on the numbers which are nevertheless provided by public institutions. So on this, the proposal is let's create something which would be called WorldStat, which would be, in the cloud, a sort of aggregation of available statistics so that each and everybody on this planet will be able to access them in a single click. This doesn't seem to be rocket science. I'll come back to that in a minute. And this would probably offer a wealth of information which, for the moment, hasn't been aggregated and is available in silos, such as the reality is that this information is not available to actors. Another example, which is in the area of taxation, we all know that taxation is one of the clearly neglected issues in global governance. It's not the only one, but it's one that really matters for many reasons, both for states, for business, and for citizens. We stopped short of proposing one more big scheme of harmonization of corporate taxation throughout this planet, but we suggest that each and every sovereign nation state notifies somewhere in the cloud its tax corporate regime. Our conviction being that if you do that, which shouldn't be a big problem because that's something you usually can find on the website of the finance ministry of the country, but if this is done together somewhere in the cloud accessible, then the sort of transparency impact it would have would probably trigger a political movement that would not automatically go to harmonization, but at least would provide the necessary benchmarks and comparative to move in this direction. And we all know that on this planet there's probably 100 mayors who are more powerful than half of the members of the UN General Assembly, not least because of the size of their towns. That we suggest that in order to fight new non-communicable diseases, which we have identified as a big challenge for the future, a coalition of the cities would probably be able to take the lead, establish the necessary targets, methodologies, and then the rest of the system would follow. So that's a sample of these examples. Because we are in Geneva, and many international organizations have their headquarters in Geneva, let me mention en passant that we also made a bit more provocative suggestion, which is that each and every international organization should insert in its constitutions rules a sort of, if not a sunset clause, although a large part of the commissioners were really in favor of a full-fledged sunset clause. The compromise was that these organizations should at least every sort of tenure go back to square one, do the necessary spring cleaning and deck cleaning, and review their mandates, their purpose, their mission, so that the international system gets back to sort of a bit of a more tidy organization, whereas we know that for the moment, because most of these organizations were created 10, 15, 20, most of them 50 years ago, in any sort of normal system, you don't do something during 50 years without, at some stage, getting to the question, am I right in doing this? And the way I do it is the way I do it in conformity with the initial intention when I started doing this. We all know that, whether it's individual, corporate, or association. So there's no reason in our view to exempt the international system from this sort of good sense test. Let me now come to my conclusion. As I said a moment ago, one of the big findings is that we need to mobilize non-state actors if we want these issues to be better dealt with than what we've been until now. Which in a way, if I'm public law specialist, I will interpret in saying we need to demonopolize international life from the old Westphalian system of 200 sovereign nation states. In other words, we cannot just rely, as many of us, including me, I must say, some part of my life and thinking on global issues, we cannot just rely on the notion that global institutions, global rules, which stem from the aggregation of various sovereign entities, can do the trick. Experience has shown that this, in many cases, does not work, or it works after decades, whether the solution should have been found within half a decade. And this is where the involvement of the engagement of non-state actors, such as business and civil society, becomes extremely important. And if you look at these proposals, all, if not all, most of them have this common characteristic. And if I had to sum up, for the practitioners of international relations and international life, the sort of also main finding, I would say that what these very examples which we have desiccated have shown is that there is a sequence which sometimes worked, sometimes did not work, starting with knowledge, knowledge moving to awareness, awareness moving to mobilization, and mobilization moving to action. If I take the example that worked as compared to the example that didn't work, where it worked was when this sequence, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, happened. Where it didn't work was one of the bridges between stage 1 and stage 2, or stage 2 and stage 3, or stage 3 and stage 4 didn't work. And this is an important lesson for the future, not least because moving from knowledge to awareness is a specific challenge. It has to do with science, but it also has to do with media. It also has to do with civil society penetration. Moving from action to mobilization, moving from knowledge to mobilization is mostly a question for civil society, for citizens. Moving from mobilization to action is mostly something for those who have a power to change things on the ground. Again, whether it's public entities, subnational entities, whether it's business corporations, or whether it's civil, the organizations of the civil society. Final point, we've always thought from the very beginning that where we would succeed or not succeed was not in interesting discussion. We had extremely interesting discussions. I learned a lot during the discussions, and I think that's true for all commissioners. Where we would succeed would not in writing a report. Many have written extremely impressive and good reports. Where we would succeed would be in changing a bit of the reality we are confronted with. And this attitude, which was there from the very beginning, led commissioners, after we issued the report in the middle of October, to organize themselves to try and follow up on a number of these initiatives. So they discussed the report, they worked on the report, they agreed on the report, but what they did, which was most important, was they individually, each of them, engaged in trying to follow up and to test these various areas with their own networks, with their own specialities, which is what's happening for the moment. Now, we sort of mid-February. At this stage, I think the jury is still out. And I'm insisting on this point because this might interest quite a number of you. A few of these suggestions, among which the one I have mentioned, seem to have attracted attention and to get a bit of traction from various quarters. The C20, 30, 40, we've noted interesting signals from the C30 and the C40 that they could work together and then put pressure on the C20. Maybe sometime short term could happen without waiting for the next and the next and the next COP 42, 43, 56, 75 this, that something could happen short term. Onwards that, we've just detected that within this community of statisticians, whether public institutions or whether private institutions, there is quite a lot of interest in trying to set up the principles of how this cloud world stat could work. I didn't mention cybersecurity, which is of course one of the challenges in the future, but here again there is a bit of interest on how we create a platform to exchange experiences on this. So that's what now we are after. This is why I'm spending part of my time in presentations such as the one we are having together tonight. We are convinced that at the end of the day, the solution is not in globalizing local problems, but in localizing global problems. And localizing global problems is something which in many ways is in your hand. So if I had to give a simple summary of this, during decades we thought that the solution to problems of the future was in the hands of mega global public institutions. They certainly have a role, but we are convinced after this 15 months of work, we are convinced that there is more potential in involving individuals, citizens, corporations, again, civil society organizations, and that at the end of the day, this is what will make the difference. So in many ways, what we found out is that at the end of the day, it's people like you who can make a difference. Thank you.